Okay, hello there Year 11 and welcome to Mr. Rasides' most recent attempt to embrace 21st century technology. And I thought what we'd have a look at today is an inspector calls and how to plan a response to a character-based essay. A lot of the time, one of the main problems students have is that they say, "Sir, I don't know how to plan." And obviously there are many different ways to plan an essay, and you should be warned before we get started that this is only one of them. So it's about finding what works for you. Okay, so as you already know, on the IGCSE literature paper, for the inspector calls section, you are always given a character-based question, and we can see this as we scroll through the years. 2011, it was explore the character of Sheila and how she's changed by the inspector's visit. Moving onwards, how successful is the inspector in his role? In what ways are the characters and Sheila and Eric Burling important in this play? Etc., etc. Now, at the time of producing this presentation, the one character who is noticeable by her absence from the IGCSE paper is this particularly cold and sterile character, Mrs. Burling. So this is going to be a bit of a general overview of how to produce an essay, but also with the focus on Mrs. Burling, because this is the character that I want you to focus on for your homework. But before we get on to that, I just thought I'd show you a sample introduction to an essay based around Mr. Burling. We've already done this in class, but it doesn't hurt to go over it again. Now, I think the introduction to an essay is absolutely vital because it sets the tone, and you can essentially set out exactly what you're going to say in the body paragraphs of your essay in the introduction. So here we go. Explore how Mr. Burling is presented in an inspector calls. Now that is a very, very simple question. Often they're a little bit more specific than that in the exam, but the same principles apply. So the first thing you'll notice I've done in the introduction is I have addressed the question. So the question is, explore how Mr. Burling is presented in inspector calls. Immediately, straight away at the start of my essay, I've talked about the fact that Mr. Burling is of great significance and he's used by Priestley for many different reasons in the play. But I then become even more specific down here. I've actually set out exactly how he's used. He explores many issues including social division, the gap between the rich and the poor, the concept of change and the divide between the old and young generation. Finally, Burling is used to explore selfishness and greed. Burling is an incredibly pompous character who struggles to accept any responsibility for his actions. So immediately in the introduction, I have covered a lot of ground, and I've also began to allude to context, which I will come on to shortly. So now that I've set out all of the things that I want to say in my essay, I've actually done the hard bit. I can then sort them out into paragraphs. So what you'll notice down here is that these are the topic headings for my body paragraphs of my essay. But all I've done is lifted them straight from what I've already said in my introduction. Now, the only difference is that I've ordered them from what I consider to be my weakest or most simple point to my most powerful, hard-hitting point that links to themes and links to context and links to the ideas of the writer. So my most important idea is going to be the concept of change and generational divide. So I'm going to leave that to last because I like the idea of building through an essay. In other words, starting off with your most simple point and building through to your most powerful point. Okay, so let me introduce you to your essay title then. Now, it's not uncommon for the exam board to give you a little quote from the character they're asking you to explore, just as a means of getting you thinking and getting the creative juices going. So this is the one I've chosen for you. You know, of course, that my husband was Lord Mayor only 2 years ago. And the question is, explore the presentation of Mrs. Burling in an inspector calls. So what I'd like you to do is just pause the video for a second and think about how you would go about planning a response to this title. So in other words, what are you going to cover in the introduction, and how are you then going to use what you've said in your introduction to form the body paragraphs of your essay? I will do something similar, so I will show you an example in a second, but just think, how are you going to split out your paragraphs? What are you going to be talking about in each of those body paragraphs? So pause the video now and have a go at that. Okay, so I've basically planned out my 4 body paragraphs here. I will have mentioned a lot of this stuff in the introduction, so it's very clear to the examiner that I know what I'm talking about now. Please do not panic if your ideas do not exactly match mine, because there is a lot of scope for interpretation in this question. But let me talk you through what I consider to be my 4 main points. Okay, so Mrs. Burling, she is a woman who has spent her entire life as a member of the social elite. She comes from old money and is very rigid in her outlook and values. Now, that is not qualified yet, and I will need to offer evidence, and I will need to expand on that idea. But that is one of my ideas. Here's another one. Priestley uses Mrs. Burling to explore gender roles within Edwardian society. She is used to emphasise the changing role of women within society. So we know that the play is set in 1912. And we know that by the time it was first performed in 1946, a lot had happened to alter the role of women within society. Now, I will go on to context after I've walked you through these 4 body paragraphs, so stay with me if you would like to learn more about that. Okay. Another point. Mrs. Burling is presented as a cold, aloof, and unsympathetic woman. I will come back to that in a second. And finally, she's presented as a woman who is more than happy to live in a man's world. She presents a stark contrast to Sheila, her young and increasingly open-minded daughter. So those are going to be my 4 body paragraphs, and by the time I've expanded on my views, I'm just going to finish with a very, very short, snappy conclusion, and that'll be the end of my essay. Well, what I'd like you to think about is, what order would you explore these ideas in? In other words, what would form your first paragraph and what would form your last paragraph? With the idea in mind that we are trying to build to a climax. So pause the video and just think. You don't have to write anything down, just think about the order of these paragraphs and we'll see if we agree. Okay. Hopefully you established that I would start off with this idea here, because it's the most simple, the most straightforward, and it immediately lets me into the essay to explore Mrs. Burling's character. But even here, there's a lot to say. She's a cold, aloof, unsympathetic woman. Isn't it interesting that Eva Smith, a member of the disenfranchised, the dispossessed, the poor, working classes, Eva Smith is far more sympathetic than Mrs. Burling, who has the ability and the money to affect change in society. Eva Smith, who has nothing, lets Gerald off the hook. She protects Eric, and yet Mrs. Burling, despite all of her wealth and power, casts Eva Smith aside. So again, through the character of Mrs. Burling, we are presented with the idea that it doesn't matter how much money you have, it's how you treat people that matters. So even in that opening paragraph, even though I'm going to be talking about simple things like how Priestley describes her in the stage directions and how she first, and what we realise when she starts speaking to people, there's still a lot to talk about. So that would be my first paragraph. Okay. Hopefully you'd have established that the next paragraph I'd have gone to is this one. Because again, I'm starting to build now, I'm going to start talking about context, but it's not my most powerful point, which I'm going to save to the end of my essay. Okay, so she's a woman who has spent her entire life as a member of the social elite. She comes from old money and is very rigid in her outlook and values. So obviously I need to qualify what I mean by this very rigid in her outlook and values. We know that she is Burling's social superior. And isn't it interesting that she's married Burling at all? Is this a sign that things are beginning to change within society? Is it a sign that Mrs. Burling and Mr. Burling's marriage was purely an act of practicality? We know that the upper class system that had been in place firmly since the Victorian era is starting to bend, and it's starting to fray a little bit here. But Mrs. Burling is totally trapped within this world, and she's a woman who doesn't know what it is to suffer, doesn't know what it's like to experience pain, and more importantly, she doesn't understand anything about the outside world. She fails to understand that her own son is an alcoholic. She fails to understand that the people that she thought were well respected in society are actually often crooks. People like Mr. Meggerty, who's described in the play, actually proves out to be a womanising fool. And next, I'm going to go to this paragraph here. She is presented as a woman who is more than happy to live in a man's world. She presents a stark contrast to Sheila, her young and increasingly open-minded daughter. Now, please stick around, because I'm going to talk about context, because you have to in your essay. But on a very, very simple level, Mrs. Burling is used, because of the way she's brought up and the time in which she lived, she's used to the men making all of the decisions. And at one point in the play, she actually says, "Listen to your father, Sheila. You know, and when you marry Gerald, you'll have to accept that he's going to go away and earn his money." And that presents a very stark contrast to Sheila, who very, very quickly begins to understand that women have just as much right to make a decision within the society as men. Remember, this was the time of the fledgling suffragette movement, when people like Emily Pankhurst had paved the way for better rights for women. And finally, I would finish off with this paragraph, because I think this is my most powerful one. Priestley uses Mrs. Burling to explore gender roles within Edwardian society. She is used to emphasise the changing role of women within society. So I think we can all agree that women are treated pretty badly in this play. Even though Mrs. Burling might not acknowledge it, she is just as much a victim of a male-dominated society as Eva Smith. The reason she's so closed off, the reason she's so blinkered, is because she's used to the men completely dictating her actions. Sheila herself is marrying a man that she really doesn't know anything about, and as soon as she discovers that Gerald has got skeletons in his closet, she calls off the engagement. Eva Smith, as we know, even though Gerald to a certain extent is very kind to Eva Smith, he is described as her knight in shining armour, her prince. In other words, when women are desperate in this play, and in society in general, who's there to save the day? It's the men. That's how unequal, that's the amount of inequality we are dealing with in this society. Okay, so those are my 4 paragraph plans, and I hope that makes sense. I'm sorry if I've waffled on, but you can come back and play this video as many times as you want. So that's how I would plan out a response to explore the presentation of Mrs. Burling in Inspector Calls. Okay, you might have had enough for now, because I do realise that I've waffled on a little bit, but I'm now going to go on to talk about context. Miss Crofton has put together a fantastic PowerPoint on context that I'd just like to walk you through and share with you. So if you've had enough for now and you want to write your essay, crack on, although there will be some very useful things that you could potentially use in this essay if you stick around and listen to my next couple of slides on context. Okay, so why is context important? Pretty obvious, really, to help you fully understand the text, as personal views, beliefs, events and attitudes from the period will have an influence on the content, plot and themes of the play. So to fully understand an Inspector Calls, you will need to understand what happened in Britain the time it was set. I would actually argue that in order to get an A or an A star, you need to be a little bit more perceptive. You need to show that you understand exactly what's going on in this play. Okay, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about Victorian England. Okay, So here's a nice little comparison for you. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but look